All right, we're continuing our study of the life of Abraham. We are in Genesis chapter 22 this morning, a chapter that's, I think, pretty well known amongst most Christians, and I think the reason for that is there's been a lot to glean from this chapter over the years, so people are often drawn to it. We did start a little bit of this last week. We started the first three verses of Genesis 22, where we see God tells Abraham to take his son Isaac and offer him as a sacrifice on one of the mountains of the region of Moriah. Now, when you just have that statement, certainly something sounds off there a little bit. And of course, Isaac is the son of the promise. So, how is going through with this going to work with all these things that God has promised? How is this going to work with God's plan here that he's been telling Abraham over and over and over again since way back when, like 10 chapters ago? How is this going to work? Now, clearly, Abraham did not understand exactly what God was planning to do here, but he's going to go through with it anyway. We looked back at Hebrews chapter 11, verses 17 through 19, where the writer of Hebrews gives us some insight into what Abraham's thoughts were at the time. And verse 19 specifically states that Abraham reasoned that God could simply raise Isaac from the dead. Almost in a nonchalant way, I guess some of the translations make that sound. And this is something that happens in the Bible with, some frequency, especially in the New Testament. We see people being raised from the dead. It seems not uncommonly. It seems to be a thing that happens quite a bit. But in the Old Testament, that is not the case. We don't see that just a few times that happens. But the first time that is recorded in the Bible is not until 1 Kings, during the time of Elijah, in 1 Kings chapter 17. So when Abraham is thinking this, according to the writer of Hebrews, not only is Abraham reasoning that God is going to do this miraculous thing that's impossible, but he's going to do something that has never been done before, which is a really powerful testament to Abraham's faith here. Abraham is going to go through with this kind of almost blindly, because he doesn't really know what's going to happen. He doesn't really understand how God's going to make this work. But in his mind, he figures, well, God is going to make it work. Maybe here's how he's going to do it. And of course, the writer of Hebrews says that figuratively, he did receive Isaac back from death, because in his mind, Abraham had already gone through with it. Abraham was determined to do what God had asked him to do. Of course, we haven't gotten to that part yet in Genesis 22 yet, kind of skipping ahead a little bit. But Abraham chooses to leave early in the morning. He brings with him a donkey, 2 servants, and Isaac, wood for the burnt offering, and also fire and a knife are also mentioned in this chapter of things that they had with them. So where did he get the wood? I perhaps thought maybe he got the wood from that grove of trees he planted at the end of Genesis chapter 21. Perhaps it's possible several years seem to have passed between Genesis chapter 21 and Genesis chapter 22, because in Genesis chapter 21, it seems that Isaac is probably about a year old at that point. If not too much time has passed between verses 21 and 22 of that chapter. But certainly by the time we get to chapter 22, Isaac can speak, he can walk on his own, he carries the wood himself up the mountain, he's able to kind of logic how things are supposed to work, and he asks about it. So I want to say he's probably young, but he's not so young that he's helpless in this situation. So we don't have an exact age, but he is a youth with some self-determination, if you will. He has some of his own agency to himself. So that kind of wraps up what we talked about last week. Any other comments before we move on to verse 4 and onwards here? Go, Jeff.
About that statement that Abraham believed that God could raise the dead. We have the expression, God can fix anything. But we really have to think about it to realize what that means. God can fix anything. And that's what Abraham did. Abraham's great faith and example to us because he really believed that statement. It's not just something to say. I think sometimes we say that statement and we think that God would fix most things, but when we come up against something that seems insurmountable to us, we think otherwise. God can fix anything. And even if it's in a manner that you've never heard of before, if Abraham never had heard of, never had been any dead person raised to that point, we have no indication there was, Abraham just
I think he's trying to reason how it would happen.
Reasoning is
Yeah.
by faith. It is a possibility. God can do anything. There's nothing God cannot do. Just a statement for us to really think about, meditate on.
And sometimes, especially given this example here, the things that God can do, sometimes he'll do something that he's never done before. I mean, there's got to be a first time for everything. And, how many firsts were there of God doing something miraculous? And then maybe we never see that ever happen again in the Bible, but that doesn't take away from his ability to do it. It's just in that time, in that place, he chose to do it that way. And sometimes, we'll ask or we'll pray to God and ask him to help us with something or to do something for us in some way. And maybe he's going to do it, but he's not going to do it the way we think. We look at, Abraham is thought here and recorded in Hebrews 11 that he's thinking, well, God will raise him from the dead. Well, didn't exactly happen that way, but in a manner of speaking, the Hebrew writer says it did kind of happen that way. But certainly, God did it slightly a different way than I think Abraham supposed it would, but that doesn't mean that God failed in some way. He just did it a way that Abraham didn't exactly think of. We'll probably talk about a little bit more of that as we go on. Any other comments through verse 3? Okay, let's go ahead and move on, and I hope you'll forgive me. We're going to take this in kind of small chunks up to verse 9 because I really want to kind of dissect the process and the steps that are being made here to kind of, I don't want to say nitpick, but really kind of sift through it and really think about what is really going on here. So let's get someone to read for us just verses 4 through 6, please.
On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said unto his young men, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder, and we will worship and come again to you. 6.
Through 6, yeah.
And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son. And he took his hand and the fire and the knife, and they were both of them together.
Okay, so there's some really significant statements that are just kind of put in here real quick, and we don't really think about it. The first one here is, this is not a short trip. This is not like some mountain that's just in the backyard. It's like, oh, God just wants to go up to that mountain. On the third day, it says, so they've been traveling for multiple days to get to this place. Now, why is this significant, other than the fact that it just takes a long time? Well, consider that Abraham now has all this time to think about what is about to happen. He's got 3 days, all this time where they're just traveling. There's not much to do when you're traveling. They didn't have Game Boys back then. So they're maybe talking to each other a little bit along the way, but that gives you a lot of time to think. If you've ever been on a long road trip and you're just sitting in the back seat and you're just looking out the window at the scenery, it gives you a lot of time to think. So Abraham has 3 days to think about what God has asked him to do, how he's going to carry this out. And at any point in time in those 3 days, he could have decided, well, I don't really want to do this. This doesn't seem to be like a good idea. And he could have turned around at any time. So right there, that time frame, Abraham is being challenged here because there's just such a strong inclination, because we've talked about his his instincts of being a good father. He wants to protect his son, and he's got 3 days to figure out how he's going to do this. At any point, he could have turned back and said, no, this is not how this is going to happen. I'm not going to go through with this. But he still goes ahead and he travels the entire distance. So they see the mountain in the distance on the third day, and Abraham gives instructions to his 2 servants to stay behind with the donkey while he and his son travel up the mountain. Now, I'm not sure how much wood would have been required for this, but it's not going to be just a handful of twigs. So Isaac is at least old enough to carry enough for a burnt offering. How much that is, I'm not sure, but wood is not always exactly light. So again, an indication that several years have passed to get to this chapter. So Isaac is carrying the wood himself, and Abraham is carrying the fire and the knife. Now, most translations I see say the fire. I'm not sure what form that took, whether it was just like a live torch that they carried, or whether it was the material to like flint and steel to start it. I don't really know. I imagine it's probably a live fire since it uses the word fire. But we're not exactly sure. We're not told, is that a lantern or just this open air torch? But that's what he had. He was bringing those, and Isaac was carrying the wood up the mountain. So just a couple things there I think are really interesting. Any comments through verse 6?
You mentioned about the 3 days. Abraham, human beings are great at rationalizing. We can come up with excuses. Jesus at one time told a man to follow him, and he said, let me go bury my father, I believe. And another said, let me go say goodbye to my family. Jesus said, no worker who turns his head, looks back, is worthy of the kingdom of heaven. And so it's a great reminder for us to ground ourselves on our duty to God. Duty is a word that helps us understand that we do what is right regardless of how we feel in the moment. Abraham's duty was to offer Isaac. That was his duty. Anything else would have been disobedience. No matter how he might rationalize or think of excuses, 3 days is a long time. But he remembered his duty, and we need to remind ourselves of the core principles of Jesus and our life and our relationship with God, and remember that during times when it gets hard and we don't want to do God's will.
And we can think about that. Abraham would have a justification in his own mind, say, well, this is the son of promise. Surely this is not what God really wants me to do. That would be an easy thing for him to do. And I'm sure he thought about that. I have no doubt that it was in his mind of trying to figure out how that's going to work. And in fact, the Hebrew writer kind of hints at that a little bit.
Child sacrifice was an abomination to God.
Yeah.
Think of a number of excuses why Abraham would say, did I really hear that? But God was clear, and Abraham did hear and understand, and he had a duty to do. And we don't really, in our culture, in our movies and things like that, we don't promote duty. We promote feelings.
And, well, you talk about the abomination of child sacrifice. That really came into play more later on under idol worship of Chemosh and Molech, lost descendants, if you will. I won't get into that again. I think I already mentioned that before. But, there's a lot of things that Abraham, during that time, could have said, this can't be right, or God's wrong somehow, or he could have come up with any sort of excuse, but he doesn't. And that's the powerful thing here, is that he's going through with it despite all of, in his mind, perhaps red flags or concerns or whatever we might have. He's going to go ahead and follow God's command here. It's pretty incredible. Very good. Any other comments? Go ahead, Christian.
Yeah, I was just thinking, well, he and Sarah took into their own hands, making this person that was going to give all the children to Abraham, and I'm thinking, how'd that work out? So he's probably thinking, yeah, all these years, 100 and, at least 10 years or something, he's been, God's been faithful to him, so,
Yeah, and God has been doing things in ways that Abraham has not always understood. And we talked about this, I think, last week, is Abraham's faith is kind of, it's reached a new height at this point, because you have all these chapters where God is promising you're going to have a son, you're going to have this descendant, you're going to have these nations that come from you. And, Abraham gets to 100 years old until that happens. And over again, God is, reiterating the promise to him. And there are some times where Abraham's like, well, how is this going to happen? I'm an old man. My wife, she's so old. She's way past the age of childbearing. And God still says, well, I'm going to make it happen. So I think at this point, Abraham doesn't understand. I think he knows he doesn't understand, perhaps. And he's going to go through with it anyway because he's seen what God has done so far. He doesn't have a reason to doubt God because God's track record has been perfect. It just hasn't been in the way that Abraham expected or in the timetable that perhaps he wanted. But God he's gone ahead and he's done what he's promised. So that's the great thing there.
Should we assume that Abraham knew about Noah?
That he knew about.
That there was a flood and God saved the righteous.
I would say yes. I mean, Noah would have been gone by this time. But if you look down the descendants from Noah to Abraham, I believe if you calculate it correctly, Shem, Noah's son, is still around by the time Abraham is on the scene. Now, maybe by this point in Abraham's life, I haven't calculated that far. I don't know if Shem would still be around. But because when you look at the descendants, the life expectancies got shorter, but those who were of the older generation outlived a lot of them. And so Shem is still around by the time Abraham is born. So I have no doubt he knows about the flood. In fact, if you, this is kind of a sidebar, if you look at a lot of the cultures of today, the traditions, India, Greece, take your pick, many of them have a flood story of some kind. I mean, some of them, there'll be some different details or, the names will be different, but they all have a flood story. And, it's been so far removed many generations now. It's the game of telephone in some of those cases. But I have no doubt that Abraham knows about that. And I would say everyone who was on the face of the earth at that time probably knew of it, whether or not they believed it or not, or whether or not they took it to heart and said, well, maybe I should follow God because, here's what he did way back when, several generations. We think, that should be the thing that keeps everyone in line. But again, remember the book of Judges, where it only takes one generation for them to completely flip on God, where God has, got them into the promised land. They've conquered, and now they have this great land. And then the next generation comes, and they're doing everything they're not supposed to do. And so God puts them in the hands of their enemies. They cry out to God. God gives them a judge. The judge turns them back to the Lord, delivers them. Everything's good as long as that judge is alive. That judge dies. Then you repeat the process. The next generation comes and forgets about God. And that's only one generation. And that's every single time in the story of Judges, just about. So at least the ones we have detail for. So I have no doubt that a lot of the people of that time may have heard of it, but don't have any concern of it. But I would think that Abraham certainly does, given that he is considered a faithful man. He's probably heard these things. He's probably taken them to heart. That's just my supposition. I guess I can't for sure say that. That would be my guess, though. Absolutely. Any other comments before we get into the next set of verses?
Yeah, Sam,
yes.
At this point in time, are we able to say that Isaac is a type for Christ?
Oh, you're getting ahead of me.
I'm sorry. I was just looking at the 3 days as well.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, there's certainly that too. I didn't really put that in my notes, but that's something there. I'll get to the next set. We'll get to it. I'm definitely going to talk about it. I can't not talk about it. Very good. Any other comments before we continue on? Maybe we should just do that. We'll take one more small piece. Somebody read verses 7 and 8, please, for us.
But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." Then he said, "Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering." So the two of them went together.
Okay, so they're going up the mountain, it seems, and Isaac is asking where the lamb for the sacrifice is. They have all the other items. It seems that Isaac is, he's old enough, he's aware enough, he's been around Abraham enough that he knows how this is supposed to work. This is an important detail to kind of think about. He knows there's supposed to be a lamb for the sacrifice, and he's like, well, we've got the wood, we've got the fire, we've got everything, but we don't have the sacrifice itself. Where is it? Now, I don't know what he's been thinking these 3 days up until that point. Were they going to sacrifice the donkey? I don't know what he was thinking up to then. But he speaks up at this point because they're just about there, it seems. But Abraham's answer is interesting. He says that God will provide the lamb for himself for the offering. Now, this could be interpreted maybe a couple different ways. And I think it's interesting the way it's worded or the way Abraham speaks. Some people could say, well, Abraham's just straight up lying to Isaac here because Abraham doesn't know that God is going to provide for himself later. We're skipping ahead a little bit. And he's just saying this so that Isaac won't run away or resist or something like that. I don't really take it that way. I wonder if Abraham here is speaking figuratively. Remember that Isaac should not exist without God's miraculous intervention here. So if Abraham is thinking that Isaac is going to be the sacrifice and he's calling him the lamb, he's the one that God has provided. You could say, well, this is my son, and my wife went through this pregnancy and she bore him, but God provided it. There's no doubt here that without God's intervention, Isaac would not have been here in the first place. So I wonder if really Abraham is kind of speaking figuratively in a way that is correct, just kind of veiling it behind who exactly is the lamb here. I'm not sure Isaac would have understood that or not. I don't know. We can get into supposition territory pretty quickly here. I guess that's all I need to say about that. I just wanted to mention that Isaac does know how these sacrifices are supposed to go, because that's going to be kind of an important detail here in a second. Any comments up through verse 8?
This expression, God will provide, is kind of a really important expression and thought. I don't know if you remember the first time you realized your dad was not perfect. There is a point, sometimes when we're young, and we may not remember that point, that moment. But we all know that there is a point in time in which you believe your dad can do anything, no matter what. But it's important when children realize their parents are not perfect, that they understand that there is one who is above them and watching over all of us, who is perfect and is able. And to hear a parent express faith that God will provide is really important for a child, for his well-being, for his sense of safety in this life and in this world. It doesn't mean, and parent needs to be clear about this, doesn't mean bad things won't happen to us. It just means that God will ultimately take care of us here on this earth, and here in the hereafter he will take care of us. But we put our trust in him, and it's just a great expression. God will provide, God will figure it out, God is in control. These are all expressions that kind of say the same thing.
And I think I'm trying to think of where it is. I think it's Hebrews 12, actually. I'm checking up on it because I can't remember for sure. In Hebrews chapter 12, starting verse 9, it says, "Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected him for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of the spirits and lived? They disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our own good in order that we might share in his holiness." The kind of one of the things that goes along with what you're saying is the earthly fathers that we have, they do their best, but they're not always perfect, as you mentioned. But the contrast that the Hebrew writer is making here, that God is perfect and he's going to do all things perfectly, even if we don't understand it or we don't, he does it in a way we don't expect. He is perfect, and with that, there is that confidence that we can have that when God says he's going to go through with something, or when God promises something, we can be sure that that's a guarantee. There's not going to be any question about whether or not is this going to happen or not, or is God really telling the truth here or not. We can be sure what God says is true. And for any faults he may have had, we've said this a few times, Abraham seems to be a good father here, which makes this all the more probably painful for him, is he's having to go through with this, and maybe Isaac doesn't really understand how this, or what's happening here. Of course, he will in a couple verses, it seems. We'll get to that in just a second. Any other comments to verse 8? Okay, we're going to take the next sections, the rest of the chapter, because I can't split up the rest of it because it all goes together. Someone read for us verses 9 through 19 here, 9 through 19.
Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. He bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not lay your hand on your lad, and do not young men, and they rose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt at Beersheba.
Okay, a lot going on here. They reach the summit here. Abraham builds the altar. He gets the wood in order as it needs to be done. And he binds up Isaac and he lays him on the altar. Now, we don't see any reaction here from Isaac. We're not given any record of what Isaac did, what Isaac was thinking at this point. But it doesn't seem that he's resisting. He seems to be kind of being obedient at this point. But I'm sure that he understands when he's placed on the altar what is about to happen. Because we've seen in these previous verses that he's asked about, where's the lamb, where's the sacrifice? He knows how this is supposed to go. I have no doubt that when Isaac's on the altar there, he knows what is going to happen. And yet he seems to still be obedient and not struggle against this. Again, we don't have any reaction, but that seems to be the implication. Or maybe that's just me getting out of it on my own. But Abraham has the knife ready. He's ready to slay Isaac, and the angel of the Lord calls out to Abraham to stop. And in so doing, he says, I know for sure that you have this faith. He confirms Abraham's faithfulness because he was not going to withhold anything from God, even his son, the son of the promise, Isaac. And so after this, after Abraham is stopped here, he sees a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. And so God has provided the sacrifice after all, in this case, to be used as a sacrifice instead of Isaac. Now, again, there's no indication to me that Abraham knew this was going to be the way it worked out. It just is the way that God made this work out. So when Abraham says to Isaac, the Lord will provide the sacrifice, I don't think he had this in mind. Even though that is what happens, there's no indication to us that Abraham would have known that. So I don't go into this thing that Abraham knows from the get-go that as soon as he gets Isaac on that altar and he gets ready to slay him, he knows the angel of the Lord's going to stop him, and he knows that there's going to be a sacrifice behind him ready to go instead of Isaac. We don't see any indication that Abraham had that foresight. He didn't really know. In fact, the Hebrew writer, what he says in chapter 11, verses 17 through 19, seemed to contradict that idea. Abraham was thinking that, well, maybe perhaps he'll raise Isaac from the dead. So he's ready to kill Isaac. He's ready to slay him. There is no doubt that Abraham is going through with this. So when, I don't know if you ever happen upon commentaries that have that idea, or you hear someone who says something like that, well, Abraham knew God was going to do it that way. He didn't. In fact, the Hebrew writer gives a different logic, and even that one is not the way it turned out exactly. So I don't have any thought that Abraham knew this was some sneaky test, and he was going to just kind of play along with it. I don't get that idea. Now, Cheryl brought this up earlier, and we're going to go ahead and get into it. How this whole ordeal is very much a type and shadow for the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Now, certainly Abraham does not know this going into that either. This is really for people later to look back and understand that God was going ahead and he was laying the foundations for what was going to happen. This is not really about Abraham as far as the type and shadow goes. And there's a couple of different layers to this, and we can discuss it. In fact, I'd like to. Numerous times here, Isaac is referred to as Abraham's one and only son, which is very similar to other writings you see about Jesus later on, like John 3:16. God offers his one and only son, or his begotten son, depending on your translation there. Now, Isaac was not the only son of Abraham. Of course, Ishmael did exist, but Ishmael had been son off. He wasn't around anymore, and he was not the son of the promise. So I don't have any issue with the scripture wording it this way, so that you have that kind of layer there. Now, go ahead.
The other thing is, God had Adam, right? God, so that there were, God, like you were saying, Isaac was only there because of God. So was Adam. So I don't have a problem with his only son because, that means he's the son of, he's God's promise.
Yeah, and over and over, I think that's the implication there. There's some people who might take issue with it, saying, well, no, Ishmael's around. He's not the only son. But I think we've talked about this before, is Ishmael was not the son of the promise. Ishmael was not really in God's directive. That was, Sarah and Abraham coming up with kind of their own idea on how to do this. That is not to say not to say that God was cruel or anything to Hagar or Ishmael. In fact, it's the opposite. He made sure that they were taken care of. In fact, the previous chapter, God lets him know, like he lets Abraham know, I'm going to take care of him. It's going to be all right, and we see that happen. And then like Abraham, God does not withhold his son. In the example of in the instance of Jesus, he gives his one and only son, just like Abraham would give his to be offered as a sacrifice here. Now there's another layer here. If you look at it this way, and there are certainly different ways to look at this, we are all doomed to have a fate like Isaac. If you think about it, we are all destined to die, to face a judgment with no recourse. We are not perfect. We are not entirely righteous without the sacrifice of Jesus. But you have this ram. God intervenes, and he provides a lamb for us. In fact, if you go to Revelation, you'll see that there was no one that could do it except this lamb, which is obviously a stand-in for Jesus there, even though it doesn't use that word, but that's who it's talking about. And he says, here am I, let me do it. And certainly Jesus is the one that is offered as a sacrifice, so we do not have that fate. I actually want to go to something that expands upon this. 1 Peter chapter 1. Let's turn there real quick. Because Peter probably words this a lot better than I could ever do. So 1 Peter chapter 1, I'm going to read starting in verse, I think 18. For you know that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your forefathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. He was chosen before the creation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for your sake. Through him you believe in God, who raised him from the dead and glorified him, and so your faith and hope are in God. Now that you have purified yourselves by obeying the truth, so that you have sincere love for your brothers, love one another deeply from the heart, for you have been born again, not of perishable seed, but of imperishable, through the living and enduring word of God. For all men are like grass, and all their glory is like the flowers of the field. The grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of the Lord stands forever. And this is the word that was preached to you. The reason I really like what Peter says here is that he indicates to us that we are all temporary here. We are destined to eventually die and go away. But what are we going to do after that? Well, we were redeemed, not with gold or silver or anything else that is also perishable, but we were redeemed through the blood of Jesus. Jesus, who was chosen before all the creation of the world to do this task, to save us from our sins. And there's actually probably more we could pull out of that, but I'm just kind of relating this to this example that we have here in Genesis chapter 22. It's not that a lot of this is about Abraham and Isaac, but a lot of what's happening here is a foreshadowing, a type and a shadow for us to understand what Jesus' sacrifice is like, what is comparable to help us kind of understand God had this plan way in advance. Here's a little foreshadowing of what it is like. Any thoughts about the layers, the imagery, the type and shadow of this sacrifice? Anything we want to discuss? Go ahead, Jeff.
I want to think back about Isaac for a moment. As you said, there's no indication that he sought to defend himself or to beg for mercy or anything. He was a perfect type of Jesus, and that Jesus didn't fight. In fact, the Sanhedrin could not have condemned him if he had not given them the answer. Are you the Christ? He said, yes. What further need we witnesses? Pilate
And Pilate said himself that he finds no charge against him. He was ready to let him go. Yeah.
But Jesus was determined. He was calm. I'm not saying he was calm. He was not looking forward to the pain and the suffering, but he was determined. And I'm not saying that Isaac knew all this either.
Oh, no.
You see a great parallel to the faith in his father that Jesus had in the heavenly Father. He had faith in Abraham. He didn't know what Abraham was doing, but he had faith in him. And we have that same kind of faith in God. I'm not a pacifist. I do believe that a Christian can defend himself. That's my personal opinion. But I recognize that we need to have this same resignation that I am in the hands of God, and if my life ends in the next minute, God be glorified. And I'm not going to be in angst about that, because my life was always, it was given, like Job said, naked I came into this world, naked I will leave. God gives, God takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord. That needs to be our attitude toward whatever God's will is in our lives. And if we do that, then we'll be like Isaac, we'll be like Jesus in our service to God.
And there's a lot of other things. We mentioned the 3 days. I don't know how much to put into that. It's an interesting, maybe it's more than a coincidence. We also have the fact that Isaac himself carries up the wood that he would be sacrificed on, and Jesus carried his cross up to the place where he would be sacrificed. There's a lot of little things here that, I mean, we could probably expand into a whole nother lesson, but I think I've made my point here is that God is giving, he's testing Abraham, he's confirming Abraham's faith, and at the same time, he's giving us a glimpse into what is to come with Jesus. So people who knew the Old Testament and saw what was happening in Abraham's time could see, if they were in Jesus' time, they could see what Jesus was doing and say, hey, this seems really familiar. Let me look back at this. Let me understand this a little bit more. Maybe there's something here I need to know. And then, of course, for us, we see both of those in writing and record, and we can look at them side by side and say, well, God certainly had this planned out because, look, he's showing us what it's going to be like, and then he does it that way. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff there. I think that there's probably more we could say about that. Any other comments on the foreshadowing, the type and shadow of this sacrifice?
I think it's one of the reasons, too, that I'm still kind of in awe of the scribes and Pharisees having no idea. When Christ does come and this starts happening all over again, the scribes have been writing about it for hundreds of years, and yet it doesn't ring a bell.
Yeah, and that seems to be the case with a lot of them. Of course, there's a few that seem to know that something is there and seem to kind of change their thoughts about it. I think Nicodemus is probably a good example of one we have named. There's also the scribe in Mark. He's not named, but he seems to agree with Jesus on a lot of things. Perhaps was one like that. I wouldn't say all of them were against Jesus, but certainly a lot of them were. We know that because they always seem to be trying to knock him down, and they always get frustrated at that. But certainly after Jesus, after his body was taken away, have the Roman soldiers who said, he's risen, he's gone, and they're paid off to tell a different story. The people that pay him off, what are they really thinking at that point? Because they know the truth. They've been told what the real thing that happened was, even though they're kind of paying people off to tell a lie. How do they grapple with that? And we're not really told. We're not given that insight into their mind later on, but there certainly was probably a lot of contention internally on a lot of their parts. We don't know, and I don't want to suppose too much, but we do have examples of some who did see and understand. I think Nicodemus, he had a really hard time at the beginning, but I think by the time we get to the end of Jesus' life and his sacrifice, Nicodemus seems to have come around at that point. I think every indication of that is there. And let me quickly finish this section here. I know we're out of time. Just in these last few verses of what we read, the Lord again confirms his promise to Abraham. Since Abraham has remained faithful, even to the point of offering his own son. Abraham's descendants will be numerous. There'll be great nations, all that stuff we've heard before. They'll take the land of their enemies. And then at the end here, we see that Isaac Abraham and the servants return to Beersheba afterward, and Abraham stays there for a time. Now, we know he doesn't stay there forever. He's going to move again. We're going to see later on. But for this period of time, he's going to stay in the land of Beersheba, or what would be known as Beersheba, I guess, at that point. We're at a time, so we're going to stop there. There is a little section left of Genesis chapter 22, verse 20 through the end, about Nahor's sons. We'll talk about that. I don't really have too much to say except kind of adding to Abraham's family tree here. We'll talk about that next week, and then we'll get into chapter 23, where it talks about the death of Sarah.